Hello and welcome back, everyone, to Winterfaith, the quarterly interreligious conversations. And today we're talking about redemption and afterlife. I am Matt Charnay, the Jewish Life and Interfaith Outreach Coordinator here at DePaul University, and you are with the DePaul Interfaith Scholars. As I said, today's topic is redemption and afterlife. Thanks for joining us for Quirk. Well, as the Jewish Life Coordinator, I'm going to start off this discussion with a very weird little story that has bugged me for my entire life. I think I was probably in about 5th grade when the rabbi of the conservative synagogue, I was a Reform Jew, but the conservative rabbi was teaching a class that I was taking, and it was about the afterlife in Judaism. And the only real thing that this rabbi said to me was this story. So there's 2 fish in a bowl, and one fish says, "What do you think happens when we die?" And the other fish says, "I don't know, but someone changes the water in the bowl, right?" And that was it. And that always left me with a very weird, uneasy feeling about afterlife and what that means for Jews and everything. So let's take a peek into what afterlife and redemption and words like that mean to other faiths, other people from interfaith worldviews. All right, so take it away, scholars, when it's your turn to speak. Intro yourself, and we'd love to hear your perspective on redemption and the afterlife. Go for it.
Hi, everyone. I'm Saran. I'm the Catholic Interfaith Scholar. I'm going to do my best to condense very sophisticated and confusing theology into hopefully less than 15 minutes of me blabbing. It's very similar with other branches of Christianity. So Christianity as a whole, I'm hoping I can speak for most of us. The whole idea of redemption is solely one thing, and that's God's grace. And that was Jesus dying on the cross, even though he didn't have to. So Jesus dying on the cross redeemed us and saved us for all of eternity. So that act of sacrifice is what is the redemption of mankind after what Adam and Eve did in Genesis. So the whole idea is all of mankind has been redeemed through Jesus' crucifixion. And Catholics will often say, well, the teaching is that this isn't just Christians, it's all of mankind, all of humankind, everyone in the world has been redeemed through the crucifixion of Jesus. And that this is something done by God's grace, and there's nothing we can do to change that. It's already happened 2,000 years ago. But then the part where it gets complicated is when you enter the whole part of afterlife, and that's when you have to talk about salvation and the specific word of justification. To Catholics, this is where we sort of see differently than Protestants and Eastern Orthodox Christians. So for Catholics, salvation, justification, it's a process and not an event. So oftentimes you'll see with a lot of Protestants, they'll say, I've been born again, I've been saved, I accepted Jesus into my life and I'm saved. That's not a very Catholic way of looking at it, because Catholics believe that you can lose your salvation at any point in time. So Protestants generally believe that after you've been baptized, you're going to heaven. Catholics see that differently. So the biggest part of salvation justification to Catholics are the sacraments, the 7 sacraments. So baptism, communion, confirmation, marriage, and all those other sacraments. And participating in those sacraments is your way of accepting God's grace through the redemption he did. So Catholics believe that we are saved through works and faith, not one or the other on its own, but those two together. So a lot of misconceptions will be that Catholics believe you can work your way into heaven. That's not true. It's that you need to have the faith and trust and belief, but you have to show that you do have those things through your actions and your good deeds. Then moving on to the whole notion of baptism for Catholics. And then I have to briefly mention the term original sin, which I mentioned in my previous talk with Mohammed and Jackie, but I'll briefly try to glance over it here. So the whole idea is that when Eve took the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and gave it to Adam, those two sinned. That's what we call original sin. And since then, all of humanity has been damned to hell because of that initial mistake. And every human is born with this original sin. And it is through baptism that we are cleansed of this original sin. And that's why Catholics and Lutherans as well, and a few other different branches of Christianity, baptize people when they're a baby. Because the whole idea of this was that, especially like during the medieval times, the Middle Ages, the infant mortality was so high that they wanted to make sure kids were going to, like babies that died would go to heaven. There's two types of sins in Catholicism. So there's mortal sins and venial sins. So mortal sins would be, they need three criteria to be known as a mortal sin. It needs to be a grave matter, so grave in God's eyes, not your eyes. So for example, something like missing church, which to you might not be serious, but to God it's serious. So missing church, so something that's serious. And the second criteria is you need to know it's serious. And the third one is you need to choose to do it anyways, because even though you know it's serious. So for example, if you missed church on Sunday and you missed church on Sunday, but you didn't know it was serious to miss that, it's not a mortal sin. You need to fulfill all the three criteria. You need to know it was sinful and have done it anyway. Venial sins, on the other hand, are things that don't fulfill that criteria. So telling a white lie, etc., that would be classified as a venial sin. How these two different sins are reconciled, because this is an important part of how you get to justification and salvation. Catholics go to confession for a priest as a mediator between God to forgive the sins that you've committed. And the main point of confession is to get forgiveness for the mortal sins, which are the big ones that are serious. The venial sins sort of take a toll on your soul. Like there's like a count that keeps going, and certain acts of good works will reduce that count. So usually after confession, the priest will assign you penance, which is prayers you can go say or an act to go do that will bring the count down of venial sins, the less serious ones. But if you die with venial sins that haven't been brought down, then that's when purgatory comes in. So if you have venial sins, that's when you go to purgatory, and the more venial sin count you have, the longer you spend in purgatory. So purgatory is basically purging your soul of all, one by one, the count you have. Mortal sins, if you die in a state of mortal sin, nothing you can do, you're going straight to hell. So that's why to Catholics, the whole idea of confession is important, because if you confess your sins and you die, this is why often the elderly who are sick, or those who are like stage 4 cancer or have a very serious illness or terminal illness, when it's towards the end of their life and they're Catholic, a priest will come to their bedside, give them last rites, so anointing of the sick, and then they'll have a confession so that their soul is pure and they can go straight to heaven. But then the whole question comes in of like, what if you're physically unable to get confession and you're going to die? Like, what if you were, God forbid, in a plane accident or a car crash, or something bad happened to you, and like one day ago you like missed church? Like, what happens to you? And the teaching is that no one can judge the mindset or a person's attitude at the point of death. So the word contrition, like being sorry for your sins, a perfect contrition for your sin at the point of death can suffice instead of a confession, if a confession is impossible. There's sort of like 3 tracks, if you will. It's straight to hell, to purgatory, or to heaven. And Catholics are, I think, a bit different in that they believe that non-Catholics can go to heaven. And this was like established some time ago, when the teaching of the church was like that there are those people throughout the world that, for example, like take Mahatma Gandhi, and certain people would say like, maybe Christianity wasn't introduced to India at that time, or there's this tribe in the indigenous part of South America that haven't had contact with the outside world, or anyone that's not a Catholic. There's a lot of debate about it now, but oftentimes the teaching is that if someone is following their conscience without knowing, like they might say, I don't believe in being a Christian, or I don't agree with this, but they're still following their conscience to do the right thing, those people can still be saved. So it's very much of a more welcoming approach to different religions, different faiths. So the whole, basically, the whole process is the whole path to justification and salvation is a process. You can lose it at any time, but you can get it back with confession, or truly feeling sorry from what you've done if confession isn't possible. And purgatory is there to cleanse those smaller, lesser sins in the event that you do have that on your soul. So that's Catholicism, as concisely as I can put it.
Those words hold a lot of weight for Catholicism. And I think we could probably spend, with 3 non-Catholics here, the rest of our time asking you questions and clarifying about some of the things you said. And I don't want to say we don't have time for that. Of course, if anyone has a question for Saran, please ask. But yeah, like, I have so many questions about what you just said and so many things to ask you about. But I'll let the scholars take it.
I had no idea that purgatory was called purgatory because you purge your soul of your sin. That makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. And my brain is like, duh. There was something else I was thinking about, but it has slipped my mind. So give me a second to think about it.
So let me ask you this question in the interfaith friendly way I can. Like, how do you, Saran, personally feel about, like, all the things you just discussed that the church kind of says is the way it is? I know, like, Jewish law and ritual is sometimes very different about how I actually feel about the subject. And so, and you don't have to say, like, I believe in or I don't, but, like, kind of, is your experience, the Catholics you know are all like, absolutely, it happens just like this, or like, well, the idea is, or I live my life based on, or I don't know, what do you feel? Kind of, I think there's always a disconnect, especially in some very old religions, about, you know, what the rule is and what the actual everyday practice of everyone is. So how close do you feel you personally tie into, like, the church's belief in all of this?
Yeah, with the whole mortal and venial sin thing, like, I personally think that it's hard to just throw sins. There can't just be 2 boxes to throw a sin into. I think, like, there's so many different contexts that only God would know, because God would know, like, what everyone's thinking about. So, like, yeah, the example of, like, missing mass, missing church on a Sunday, like, there's always that part of me that, like, for example, I really need a self-care day and I don't want to, like, go down the street to be with a bunch of community and people. And I need that time to myself. So I just stay at home and pray instead. That's, like, to me, that seems like a fair point, considering how I would be feeling that day. So it's always like, throwing something into a box is hard, especially when everyone has a different experience and you can't always know exactly what someone's going through at any given point in time. The whole idea of purgatory has always been, like, interesting because it's mentioned in, so if you don't know, Protestant Bibles have 7 less books than Catholic Bibles, because, well, because some of them Martin Luther removed. Some of, like, throughout time there was debate whether they were, like, legitimate or not, and they found some books had less copies that would date back to the original, so they weren't deemed, but Catholics still deemed those books, for example. Those are the books that mention purgatory. So there's still like debate about that. And like throughout the Middle Ages, purgatory was the source of the whole conflict with indulgences, being abused, being sold, so you could buy an indulgence to lessen your grandparents' time in purgatory, just with money, without doing anything else. So that's where the whole corruption thing came in with the church during the Middle Ages. And I guess purgatory indulgences has this negative connotation now ever since that happened. If you're a good person and do your best to like be the best person and the nice person to everyone and take care of others and yourself, and at the same time do what you believe is right for yourself with your faith. This is the very liberal Christian side of it, that I think that should be enough, because
I have so many more questions, but I also feel like we should probably move on. So, Saran, let's talk about this more later because I'm curious.
Maybe when you all share, it'll like bring up like questions that we can kind of tie it all into. But yeah, 21 minutes of I'm loving it. But let's move a little bit on.
Hi guys, my name's Max. I use they them pronouns, and I'm the Jewish interfaith scholar. So I want to talk a little bit about what Matt was saying. I've never heard that story before about the fishes, but like that's pretty accurate for like Jewish thought on death and afterlife. So when I was in Hebrew school, when I was a kid, we never really had conversations about afterlife. For up until like college, I was under the impression that we didn't really have an afterlife, which is not entirely true. Basically, the general Jewish idea about afterlife is, I don't know, it's maybe something, it's maybe not, I'm not sure, which is really difficult, I think, for a lot of people to grasp. Especially because a lot of faith traditions, not just Abrahamic or Jewish traditions, but almost every faith tradition, you are doing acts in your life in order to achieve something in your afterlife. I think that's generally a relatively common theme in a lot of faith traditions. In Judaism, we value doing things in your life for your life. So some really important things that we talk about, the commandments. I know I mentioned this in our last conversation, I think, but we have 613 commandments in the Torah, in the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, as it's called in English. So these 613 commandments, they are things that we are supposed to do in our life. Although, as Matt reminded me yesterday, a lot of those commandments actually have to do with the temple, like the temple on the mount. And so because that doesn't exist anymore, it's hard to fulfill.
Stuff.
Right. Oh yeah. Sacrificing, animals and things that we don't do anymore. And also there's no temple there, so we can't do it anymore. But these commandments that we can do, if we think about the 10 commandments, not committing murder, respecting our parents, God is the one true God, things like these. We have to, it's our job as Jews to fulfill these commandments during our lives to make our lives better, to make our lives and to make other people's lives better. So all of this focus is on, real world or current world, this world's issues, problems, things that we're concerned about. The goal in life is to make life better. So with that, the idea of doing good deeds so that I can get to heaven, I think that is not the Jewish idea. I'm really struggling right now with trying to put this into words, so I'm really sorry. But this idea that I'm doing good things in my life because that is a good thing to do in my life. I'm not doing a good thing in my life in order to get myself to heaven. So there is a term that I do want to say. The term is Shoah, which means it is essentially the term for the afterlife that's used in academia. I did not hear that word until I took a religious studies class that was talking about Judaism from an external perspective. So you won't really hear a lot of Jews use the term Shoah unless you're talking about the Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah. But that term Shoah is not super common in a lot of Jewish traditions, but it is this idea of something that maybe comes after life. So that is like really all I have to say about afterlife for Jews, because we don't really talk about the afterlife. We really just talk about our current life. If you guys have any like questions, I might be able to answer them, but it's a very interesting conversation to have because there's nothing to talk about, if that makes sense. Matt, I kind of want to hand it over to you to see if you have anything.
No, like the only thing I would say is a little bit of clarification is like the Shoah, like we now use that word almost exclusively in like Holocaust terminology because it was such a monumental loss of life that like the ideas of afterlife and murder and like what all this stuff means kind of together, it got wrapped up in that word. And so like it's very rare to use that word outside of when you're referring to the Holocaust now.
Yeah.
But like, yes, I know what you're speaking of. The other quick thing I would mention about like Judaism and afterlife is this idea that like there's an idea in Judaism where, and Max is speaking to the point where like you can make heaven right now. Mm-hmm. Like the idea is that heaven is not far away from us. Heaven is obtainable right now. If every single person was doing all 613 commandments, which, you know, hundreds of them aren't doable anyway, but if every single person in the world was doing all the commandments, like it would be heaven. That would just be it. And like you wouldn't need to work harder for heaven later because heaven would just be here right now. And so that idea that like if we're all working together to being the best people we can be and following the commandments. And now there's even some understanding in Judaism where like, you don't have to follow all the Jewish laws. Only Jews have to follow the Jewish laws. Mm-hmm. But like, there's like very easy laws that everyone should follow. You know, don't kill each other and don't steal things and blah, blah, blah. And like, we wouldn't put the, the word oppressive is probably rude, but like the very strict rules of Judaism are not supposed to be for everybody. They're for people who want to be Jewish. But if everyone was to follow the Noahite or like the general laws, it'd be heaven right now. So no need for afterlife because it would just be heaven. And so that's a quick understanding of afterlife in Judaism, where like we're working to make it real here.
One thing that I, in my personal experience, it's interesting because every Jewish experience is extremely individual. I mean, I'm sure this is the case with every faith tradition, but from my perspective, what I know is that my Jewish experience is very different from my brother's Jewish experience, is very different from Matthew's Jewish experience. And one thing that I remember growing up, my mom, her understanding of afterlife is like a return to Adonai, a return to God, a return to the universe. So there's this idea that everything is one, everything, every living thing in the entire universe is a collective, is one. And we are people of God. We are part of God. Everything is one, everything is God, so therefore we are God. And when we die, this is my mom's theory, and I've always really attached this. But when we die, she's always said that's a return to the universe, a return to God. So our bodies go into the ground and our souls go back to this collective universe. One really interesting thing that I think about this is that it kind of directly relates to the idea of karma, or not karma, reincarnation. Because if you think about everything being one, my soul goes back to the universe when I die, then, 10, 5, 8 years later, seconds, minutes later, whatever, maybe a part of my soul ends up in a tree. Maybe a part of my soul ends up in an antelope. Maybe a part of my soul ends up as, a platelet in the earth. I love this idea of returning to the whole and then that's just what you are. You are the whole. You are everything. And that really lets you connect also with the other living things in the world, nature and things like that. If I could be a tree, then I should be loving these trees. All right, that's all I got to say about Afterlife. A little bit shorter than Saran, given that we don't have an afterlife.
I'll put a little button on what you just said. Is one of the most important prayers in Judaism is the Shema, and it says Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Like God is one, is basically what it says. And the idea that oneness is kind of the whole focus is very spot on, Max. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Saran, did you have a question?
I had something to add / question. When you talked about that heaven is all around us and is here, that just sparked something that I've seen or heard before. So don't want to make it all about Christianity, but there was this part. So in Christianity, like there's tons of different books of the Bible that didn't get included because they were deemed not authentic or not reliable.
A whole other quirk in itself we should jump into, but yes.
But so there's tons of different gospels. So in the Bible right now we have 4 gospels, and there's many others that weren't added. So like there's the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, and all that. And there was this documentary on the Gospel of Thomas, and I have it pulled up. I have the text pulled up right here, and it's interesting because this whole gospel is supposed to be things Jesus said to Thomas in secret that he didn't want the other disciples to hear. But the whole gospel is written in language that talks about like sort of panentheism, and verse 113, Jesus says, the disciples say to Jesus, like, the kingdom of heaven, on what day will it come? And Jesus says, it will not come by you watching or waiting for it. The people will not say, look over there or look over here. And Jesus says, rather, the kingdom of heaven is spread out upon the earth and people just do not see it.
That's beautiful. I've never heard that before. It's almost like Jesus was Jewish.
I'll start by addressing Matt's comment about the fact that in Jewish tradition you believe that like heaven can be around you and things like that. And I think in Buddhism we'd also agree with that. And we believe that we're just cloaked with ignorance and we only focus on ourselves. And so that's why we don't realize the potential to be enlightened while you're alive. So within Buddhism, every person and sect believes something different in regards to the afterlife. But the core of Buddhism is that Buddha set out on a quest to find release from samsara, which is the cycle of rebirth and suffering, which Hindus also believe in. But once he attained enlightenment, he ended the cycle of suffering and rebirth. And then he dedicated his life to spreading his teachings so that his followers could find the same freedom. And then where different sects diverge is in their understanding of the afterlife. And I'll first say that I don't think we equate enlightenment or nirvana with the afterlife necessarily because of the fact that we can attain it while on earth. So people think that nirvana is just like the afterlife once you die, but it's that enlightened state. So you can either think of it as while you're on earth or after you've passed on. Most Buddhists believe that death marks the end of this life and passage into the next, so the cycle of rebirth. And this life is simply one spoke in the wheel in the cycle of samsara. And through this perspective, we continue to be in samsara until we reach enlightenment. So until our soul reaches enlightenment, which may never happen. And we're reborn again and again until our negative characteristics of life, so like the cleanliness and desires, we have those things that cause us to suffer. Until those practices end, then we can be released from samsara and enter enlightenment. But until then, we're our soul is pretty much stuck in this endless cycle. And yeah, so they say that this force is so powerful that even when our body dies, the mind and the soul continues to cling on to other bodies in search of that need, that cleanliness. And it takes birth again in a new body. But in my sect of Buddhism, which is Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, and it's newer, it's one of the most modern sects in Buddhism, I've been taught that enlightenment is synonymous with Buddhahood. Enlightenment allows you to become a Buddha, and it can be achieved in your lifetime. So it can be achieved while on earth, while alive. And where we differ from the more traditional sects is that we believe that everyone is already inherently enlightened, but we just don't see it, like I said earlier, because we're cloaked by ignorance and filled with negative thoughts and things like that. And that theory is the same as how the Buddha was before he became enlightened, because the Buddha only took on his persona of the Buddha after he became enlightened while on earth. And so in my tradition, freedom from samsara, or the cycle of rebirth and suffering, isn't the only goal in life. Then the other goal would be to ultimately become a Buddha and then dedicate our lives to helping others achieve enlightenment, just as the Buddha did. We basically believe that we can become the Buddha while on earth and then help others achieve enlightenment, just as the Buddha did. But basically, I'm not sure if you all know, but the Buddha had to sit under a Bodhi tree and dedicate his life to meditating every day, reading, like gaining wisdom, only eating a grain of rice, free from all attachments to the physical world, basically. And most Buddhists in the modern world don't plan on living our lives like this, I don't think, unless you're a monk. So basically, we try to make the most of our lives on earth and hope that we'll achieve it. But I think I mentioned this in the purpose discussion, but I think I've come to terms with the fact that I'm going to do everything I can to be on the path towards enlightenment while on earth, and by doing so, I'll try to achieve it and I'll get close, hopefully, but I may never fully reach enlightenment, and that's okay with me. And we reach enlightenment by following the eightfold path, so similar to like commandments or things like that. So basically, we guide our actions and our thoughts by following this set of guidelines for our life. And it's my personal belief that when my time on earth ends, that's when I'll be free of my negative attachments, free of my suffering. So in that way, I believe that I'll be able to attain nirvana once I'm passed on. It's not my belief that I'll be reborn again, but that's all for me. Like that's all there is, basically. So it's not as complicated and written out as other traditions, but
I have a question.
Sure.
So you said you can't, this might just be completely out of ignorance. You said if you reach nirvana in your lifetime, you can become a Buddha. Buddha means teacher, correct?
No, it means enlightened one.
Enlightened. Okay, so there's the Buddha, capital T, capital B, and then there's a Buddha, little a, little b.
Right. So the Buddha that we talk about primarily is the first man who was in India, who, our story is, I think, a little bit different than the traditional story, but we learned that he grew up rich and his parents helped him in life, they sheltered him a lot. And so that sheltering was his cloak of ignorance. And once he stepped out of his mansion that he lived in, he first saw a sick man. And then he saw a poor man. He saw all these things about the earth that everyone else normally sees, but he never even saw them because he was cloaked by ignorance. And so that's when he dedicated his life to understanding the world and like trying to be a better part of it, like find his place. And so that's the Buddha, but you can be a Buddha as well. It's just a term for like being enlightened. So
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the question is more is like, because I think in other religions and faiths, and coming from a Jewish perspective, this is how I would kind of equate it, is like, we're all trying to like live a good Jewish life, and no one can be like, I did it. I lived the perfect Jewish life. Like I win.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I wonder if that's kind of a similar feeling in Buddhism, that like, we're always striving to obtain this perfection, but
Right.
like, there's no like, oh, you did it. Like, oh, this person was the ultimate Jew and they were the best one. Like, I don't know if it feels the same way, or if there is like no, like my great grandmother reached nirvana in her lifetime. Like we know she did, or I didn't know if it was understandable like that.
Yeah, I can't really answer that. I just don't, other than the Buddha himself, like the first Buddha, I'm sure there are testimonies online from maybe like historical documents about other Buddhas, maybe documenting their journey or something, but yeah, I don't really know.
It seems
Totally
like,
fair. That was a kind of a weird question. So
it seems really like all three of us have been speaking about this thing as like a very personal journey.
Mhm.
Saran was talking about how, okay, there are these rules that we have to follow, but if I didn't make it to church and I ended up praying on my own, that's my personal understanding that is still allowed and that's still okay. And, I'm saying I have this personal understanding of a return to the universe. And Emily is saying there's this personal understanding of, reaching nirvana. And like, maybe one person can think or feel that they have reached nirvana and another person might say that they haven't. And it's just so interesting and I'm sure if we were to talk to somebody of another faith, then they would say something similar, that it is like a very personal journey and you have to make your own decisions and your own understandings of all these things.
thank you so much for joining us for Winterfaith, the quarterly interreligious conversation. This is the final installment of the quarterly interreligious celebration from the Interfaith Scholars. Thank you so much. Check out our page for awesome interfaith content and what we're doing around the campus and online. Have a wonderful day, scholars. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Peace. See you soon.